Hello and welcome to Proto-Germanic Rivalistics. Today's topic is word formation, and this will be an overview where we look at the types of morphemes, that is the smallest meaningful units, and the morphological processes these participate in when Proto-Germanic words are formed. This will cover the formalities of what we need to know to derive new words, which is something that is really needed if we want our language to be alive and not just an exercise in verbal embalming, as well as how to decline any words we already have so that we can actually use them to compose something that is grammatically well formed. The morphemes at our disposal, and here I am following the practice of Dunkel 2014, are roots, particles, affixes, and endings. The morphological processes applying to these are affixation, reduplication, vowel gradation, paradigmatic conversion, and perhaps not comparable to the aforementioned, but we need to mention it anyway, paradigmatic offshoots. Compounding is of course also an important part of Proto-Germanic word formation, but I believe that needs to be addressed a little bit more in detail for it to be useful, so I've decided to cover that separately in a dedicated video. As always, if you have any questions or want to make suggestions for a future update of this video, you are more than welcome to do so on our Discord server. We have, as mentioned, 4 types of morphemes, namely roots, particles, affixes, and endings. Roots carry the semantic core of content words, that is nouns, adjectives, and verbs, such as fish, blue, and swim. Particles carry the semantic core of function words, that is connectives, correlatives, and so on and so forth, for example, and, where, whence. Affixes can modify both roots and particles. If we illustrate with examples from English, then D in defrock and ish in moreish are affixes, and moreish is without a doubt one of my absolute favorite words in English. Endings are grammatically required morphemes, such as the final S on the verb swim in the clause the blue fish swims. When we're talking about a root, we show this by marking it with a root symbol, and we also write it out in small caps. Examples of Proto-Germanic roots can be wer, to turn, bend, eik, oak, and gel, yellow. Sometimes you get the feeling that some want to boil down as many roots as they can to a verbal meaning, something which I'm relatively certain of stems from the Sanskrit grammatical tradition. But Proto-Germanic is in Sanskrit, and it seems more fruitful to me to think of roots as more typically verbal, nominal, or adjectival. Roots, barring a few exceptions, cannot stand alone, so they occupy the templatic center in the structure of content words, that is nouns, adjectives, and verbs. Affixes and endings typically need to be attached behind the root for us to be able to actually use them in a grammatically well-formed clause. One example when this isn't the case can be root nouns, which take no ending in the vocative singular, that is the case of direct address. So should you for whatever reason need to call the attention of the knight, your foot, or a mouse that happen to be sitting on the path you are trotting on, these would actually be the bare roots. That is nacht, fot, and moos, as opposed to the nominative singular, which is the case for the grammatical subject, nachts, fots, and moos. And in the latter we call to mind that the little superscript s isn't pronounced. It just tells us that it's a shortened geminate, and we wouldn't write it out other than in isolated examples like this. Roots are subject to vowel gradation, which is what accounts for the difference between the root fet, meaning to walk, step, and its derived noun fots. Also applying to roots are non-productive relics of reduplication and affixation, and we'll look at what those are shortly. Particles are essentially grammatical roots. Some particles can, just like roots, take affixes, but unlike roots, they can also stand independently or be proclitic or enclitic or appear as members of compounds. I also write these in small caps, and here I'll be using a bullet point to mark them as particles. I'm not aware of any convention in use here, so this is just my thing, and from time to time I change my mind, but for now it's small caps and bullet points. Particles that can form stems are, for example, he, proximal deixis, yen, removed deixis, and sum, assertive existential indefinite. Particles that are enclitic are, for example, se, contrastive focus, and u, interrogative. I should add right away that glossing se as a particle of contrastive focus is just my tentative analysis. I haven't found a reason to gloss it as anything else so far, but if I come across one, I'll just have to change my mind. As we've already seen in the video on stress, a clitic particle can attach either to a certain grammatical word, such as for example a pronoun, irrespective of its position in a clause, or they can attach to the first constituent of a clause, also known as Wackelnagel's position, which was the second grammatical word in the Proto-Indo-European clause. That's a bit of a mouthful if it's the first time you hear it, and it's one of the many fun corners in the dreamland of grammar that we'll have a reason to revisit later on. On screen you can see our familiar examples with the interrogative particle u, as well as the non-specific or dubitative existential indefinite particle hona. Mogode så drinkarna, can you two drink? Einat hona, anyone. In Proto-Germanic, proclitics, probably more commonly known as verbal prefixes or preverbs, can also count as first constituents, in which case an enclitic particle can appear between the first or outermost proclitic particle and a root, resulting in a discontinuous predicate, as we've also already seen previously in Frache ino gauchwase weed. He asked him if he could now see anything. Affixes are bound morphemes that modify the meaning of either a root or a stem. These cannot be separated from the root or stem by clitics. Prefixes are affixes that we attach before a root, and a suffix is an affix which we attach after a root or another suffix. Prefixation proper occurs with nouns, adjectives, and correlatives. Examples of these can be Alachaimas, Cosmos, and yes, that's a calque from modern Icelandic, Ingrones, greenish, and Kahwalikas, every. We don't need to dwell more upon prefixes for now, but we'll come back to them in greater detail whenever I get around to recording a video on word structure. Infixation, to which here I'm not counting n presents, which is something we'll return to when we get to verbs, only occurs, as far as I'm aware of, in the root stand, which appears with an n infix in the non-past stem of the primary verb. As it's just one occurrence, we don't need to linger around this. For us it's just an irregular verb for which we just learn the principal parts and we'll be good to go conjugating it any way we need to. Regarding suffixation, a suffix attaching directly to a root gives a primary derivation, but should one or more suffixes be applied after this, we end up with a secondary derivation. Typically, but not always, each suffix modifies the meaning of whatever we already had before, and together root and suffixes make up a stem. Let's add primary suffixes to the roots wer, aik, and gel, as well as to the particle sum. Here, as shown on screen, mi is a rare noun-forming suffix whose original meaning, as far as I know, is obscure. Ina is an adjectival suffix denoting material, and wa is also an adjectival suffix denoting a chromonym. The a in summa is, to my knowledge here, merely a stem formative without any particular meaning. We now have 4 stems in front of us. The first is for a word for an animal with an elongated cylindrical body without extremities, such as a snake or a worm. The second is the adjective oaken, the third is the adjective yellow, and the fourth is the pronominal stem for some or someone. I'm aware of that our adjective yellow seems to have a more complicated history than this, but for our purposes we can analyze it as a regular chromonym for yellow. This final part of a stem, which can be a, I, u, an, and a few others, is the stem formative element. So from our examples we have 1 I-stem noun, 2 A-stem adjectives, and 1 pronoun that takes adjectival A-stem endings as well. Come to think about it, I'm not sure what to call these stems in English, whether to say A-stem nouns or A-stem nouns, for example. If my current habit is grinding your gears, please leave a comment. In any case, the stem formative will be deleted if a secondary derivation with a suffix beginning in a vowel is applied, and you can see examples of this too on screen now. The stem aita, ulcer, boil, becomes aitila, gland. Likewise, the stem atan, father, becomes atilan, little father, and so on and so forth, as you can see in the list. At the moment of recording this, I'm not aware of any example with a stem formative u being deleted this way. Should you have one, please leave a comment and let me know. We can't use the bare stems in an utterance, so we have to add endings, of which there are a whole lot of. This whole lot we need to learn by heart, and if that sounds discouraging, the good news is that the more of them you learn, the easier it is to remember even more. This is partly due to resemblances and reoccurring patterns, and partly just due to that your ability to remember endings will improve the more you let your brain work on it. Endings tell us, for example, whether a phrase, such as the green snake or an oaken table leg, is the subject, object, or perhaps the instrument of a clause. A clause isn't quite the same as a sentence, but if these terms are new to you, you won't be far off if you think of it that way for now. We'll begin with just adding the nominative singular endings, that is the endings which tells us that we are meeting with the grammatical subject and that this is just one and not two or many. We now meet with the fully functional grammatical words wurmis, aikinas, gelwas, and sumas. And now you could also see that I've shifted the morpheme boundary between the primary derivational suffixes and the endings. Where we place this boundary depends on what is under consideration. If we are talking about stems, then, as we know now, the final vowel of the suffix is seen as belonging to the stem. But when we are talking about a declined word, that is a stem plus a grammatically required ending, it can often be more beneficial to analyze the final vowel of the derivational suffix as part of the ending. This becomes more clear if we, for example, compare the nominative singular and the genitive singular endings of our word for an animal with an elongated cylindrical body without limbs. The nominative singular is wurmis, while the genitive singular is wurmais or wurmis. We can't keep the boundary between the morpheme 6 throughout the declensional paradigm, as stuff obscuring this boundary happens during declension. We have seen reduplication in the past of strong class 7 verbs in previous videos here and there, and we'll now cover what else we need to know about it. Firstly, we need to mention that reduplication in the following reflexive state we see in Gothic, which is also the way I do it. But judging from the reflexes of reduplicating verbs in Northwest Germanic, the picture could have been a little more complicated, and it has been debated. We won't mention anything more of that in the following, but should you want to read more about it, you can do so as usual in Fulk 2018, Ringe 2017, and Jon Axel Harðarson 2017. The reduplication syllable, or the duplifix, in the past stem consists of the first phonemic consonant plus the vowel e. Hence, gretarna, to cry, yields, gegråtund, they cried. Keep in mind that the labiovelars, though written with a digraph, are single phonemes. Hence, hoparna, to boast, and hwehopund, they boasted. Also keep in mind that initial sk, st, sp are also treated as single phonemes, wherefore we probably also should consider them as such. So these will also be reduplicated in their entirety. Thusly, we have skythana, to separate, and skaskaidund, they separated. If a root begins with a vowel, the reduplication syllable will simply be a short e. We see this in aukana, to increase, and eaukund, they increased. If a root begins with an s, then this will in the onset of the root become voiced after the duplifix. This happens for example in seana, to sow, and sesound, they sowed. Consonant voicing might also have happened in the root thre, which means to turn something like a potter's wheel, and also in the extension to shape clay on the same. Hence threana, to turn, and thedround, they turned. Now you can read accounts where all root initial unvoiced fricatives are assumed to have become voiced fricatives in reduplication. Thus you can meet with chaitana, to be called, and chegaitund, they were called, and I pronounce it here against my usual habit with a voiced fricative just for clarity's sake. My impression, which could be wrong, is that these reconstructions with consonant voicing applying all across the board isn't among the most common given in handbooks, but reminding ourselves that we are doing revivalistics here and not historical linguistics, you should just go with what you prefer. I don't do this, but either way is fine, and if you also mark main stress here like I do, the chance that anyone will misunderstand you should be very slim. Vowel gradation entails switching one vowel for another from within a fixed series of vowels. This happens to some extent across conjugation, declension, and derivation. These series of vowels are referred to as classes 1 to 7 with capital Roman numerals, which I now show on screen. These classes are parallel to the classes of strong verbs whose principal parts show the same series of vowel gradation in their roots. The vowels within the slots of these series are called grades. These have traditional labels that are useful within historical linguistics. Those labels, however, don't fit all the grades in all classes, even though they for our intensive purposes behave the same. Therefore, I quite a long time ago just decided to call the grades first, second, third, and fourth. Occasionally it's still useful to refer to zero grade with its traditional label instead of fourth grade, and we'll do so if it helps us understand what's going on in some certain place. To my pleasant surprise, when I noticed it, Fulk 2018 also calls the grades by number, so it's just not my thing, and I believe the reasons are good to adopt this practice, at least for revived Proto-Germanic. If we pretend that a root is a syllable for a very short while here, we can tell by its shape, that is, from the nucleus and the coda, which class of vowel gradation it belongs to. On screen you can now see each class and what first grade and coda are expected for them. For clarification, the difference between class 4 and 5 is that the coda in the former consists of a sonorant, that is either r, l, m, n, and the coda in the latter is any non-sonorant. Class 6 roots have a short a in the nucleus followed by just one consonant, while class 7 roots either has a long vowel or diphthong in the nucleus or a short vowel followed by two coda consonants. Class 6 roots are often somewhat misleadingly called light as opposed to heavy class 7 roots. Now we are talking about morphemes here, not syllables, so calling them light and heavy isn't particularly helpful, but you will without a doubt see this in some of the literature. We really want to learn how to recognize the class of a root at a glance, but this becomes much more easier if we do so by learning the principal parts of a verb for each class. The principal parts are the infinitive, as in to bite, the past third person singular, as in he, she, it, bit, the past third person plural, as in they bit, and the past absolutive resultative participle, as in bitten. You can pick any verbs you want, or you can use the following examples. I'll read them aloud, and as usual I'll be pronouncing them the way I prefer, so if you're not used to it, keep in mind that it's intentional, and you should of course pronounce them the way you prefer. It really doesn't matter. We can't learn and speak historical Proto-Germanic no matter how much we might want to, and no choice here will make revived Proto-Germanic more or less genuine. There are really likely only two circumstances where it is called upon to be more circumspect regarding pronunciation. The first one is if phonology and phonetics is what makes you tick. The second is if you are, say, participating or consulting in reenactment in private, or for some radio show, or a television program, or what have you. And even then, if you stick to and read just one handbook as if it were the Bible, you'll still be the opposite of cautious, and you'll be missing out on all the diverging opinions and arguments on the whole lot of the details that you might have wanted to be mindful of. In the end, you're going to have to make discretionary decisions anyway, and it's more a matter of being aware of what you do and why, rather than finding the one single correct answer. Enough of that, here are examples of verbs for each of the classes that might make it easier to remember them. Class 1, bitana, bite, bitund, bitanas, to bite. Class 2, brautana, braute, brutund, brutanas, to fracture. Class 3, flechtana, flachte, fluchtund, fluchtanas, to plait. Class 4, berana, barre, berund, buranas, to carry. Class 5, gebana, gabe, gebund, gebanas, to give. Class 6, farana, fore, forund, faranas, to travel. Class 7, skaithana, skeskaithe, skeskaidund, skaidanas, to separate. Now we'll look briefly at paradigmatic conversion. Nouns can have a clear semantic relationship without it being productive to view one as derived from the other, as the only formal difference between them appears to be the stem formant. That is, you can't actually see any trace of a derivation from a Proto-Germanic synchronic point of view, it's just the paradigm that differs. In themselves, paradigms primarily convey just grammatical information, but an available choice between two can induce a semantic interpretation. A conversion between male and female sex is the most obvious, as in the following examples with conversion between male and female agent and that between male and female animal. Here we see a couple of examples of this. I won't read them out loud because my vocal cords are killing me, but what we would like to know here is why there, for example, are conversions between male and female animals from masculine A stems into both feminine on and O stems. This could of course just have been wavering with no particular reason behind it, or it could be some noise due to a later change of stem that's clouding the picture for us, so to speak. I don't know. If we plow through a dictionary, with great pleasure I might add, we can find a few other suspected conversions as well between collectives and singulatives. It's just that only 1 or 2 examples are given, which really isn't much to go on. That said, I still assume the authors have a reason for mentioning them in the first place, and the reason I even bring them up here is because I'm hoping that perhaps someone of you who might be listening to this might know a little more, or have a few more examples. If you do, I'd very much like to know too. Now it could be that some handbook somewhere which covers Proto-Germanic to a lesser or greater extent mentions paradigmatic conversion, but if that's so, I don't think I've read it. Or maybe I have, but was half asleep while doing so. Or maybe I did and have just forgotten it. Could be any of them really. But I'm pretty certain I first came across paradigmatic conversion in an article on Lithuanian, and that's how I came to think there might be benefits to thinking of some cases in Proto-Germanic this way too, regardless whether or not they were clear derivations in Proto-Indo-European. Unfortunately, I can't remember which article it was, and I didn't make a note of it, but if I'm going to guess, it was probably something written by Axel Holfoot, as he's someone whose work I always enjoy to read. Finally, we need to mention paradigmatic offshoots. This happened, once upon a time, a very long time ago, when various stems in different cases in complex paradigms that showed a lot of consonant and vowel gradation were reinterpreted as new and more regular stems. While it is of course possible, these paradigms are a mess to keep track of, and barring a few exceptions that I happen to find appealing, I stopped doing so as it took a lot of the fun away from composing just about anything. If you've used these early paradigms yourself, I'm sure it's obvious why they fell apart. Either way you decide to go for yourself, that is early complex paradigms or paradigmatic offshoots, both are equally Proto-Germanic. I just happen to advocate the latter, both because I enjoy the writing process much more that way, and whatever I write is going to be easier to parse for anyone who'd wish or bother to try. The book you want to read here to get a good picture of what it could have looked like is of course Kronen 2011. I'll just take one example, albeit one marked with a question mark by Kronen, but I happen to like it as it means mushroom or sponge, so I won't let that bother me. I'm just going to use the forms given by Kronen now, so don't look at me askance here. The nominative singular, as given by him, was swambo, and the genitive singular sumpas. This paradigm split off into a whole bunch of new stems: swamba, swamma, swamman, swampu, swumpa, and while he doesn't mention it, likely also swampa. The latter, swampa, that is swampas in the nominative singular, is what I usually use as a generic word for mushroom, but swumpa at least seems to be the etymon of Swedish sop, which is only used for boletes. That's a nice word to have, even if it's not a quote-unquote proper derivation. And besides, it did happen, so why shouldn't we take advantage of it? Proto-Germanic isn't Esperanto, so not everything is neat, tidy, or predictable. If you're still with me here at the end, that was it for today, and I hope you found at least something of what we looked at informative. Should you want to leave a comment or have some suggestions for a future update of this video, there is no reason to be shy or hesitant, and the link to our Discord server is available in the channel description. Until next time, be well.